Seoul. This is Medic 5 currently inbound to your facility.
Honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, good morning, and of course, good afternoon. And welcome back to the 2022 World Emerging Security Forum. And now we'd like to begin the session 2 on health security of the 2022 World Emerging Security Forum under the theme of Lessons Learned from the Pandemic and Prospects for a Global Pandemic Treaty. The health security session will consist of 2 keynote speeches, a panel discussion, and of course, we would like to have a Q&A session at the end of our session. So during the session, those who are joining us online, you could leave any comments or questions in the comment box, and the participants here at the site can send their questions through the QR code that you can find on forum leaflet. So ladies and gentlemen, we would like to ask for your active participation until the very end, and we will try our best to answer your questions. Thank you very much for your kind cooperation. Then with that, we would like to have the keynote speeches. As I mentioned before, we would like to have 2 keynote speeches at this session. The first keynote speech will be delivered by Mr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, Director General of the World Health Organization. Next, we would like to have another keynote speech delivered by Mr. Seth Berkley, CEO of GAVI, the Vaccine Alliance. So they have sent us a very meaningful pre-recorded video. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's get our attention to the screen with a big round of applause.
Excellencies, esteemed guests, dear colleagues and friends, I thank the Republic of Korea for its leadership in global health security, including through the Act A Facilitation Council, the Group of Friends of the Treaty in Geneva, and the Group of Friends of Solidarity for Global Health Security in New York. I'm also deeply grateful for the Republic of Korea's financial support for COVAX. Hamsamida. More than 6 million lives have now been lost to COVID-19. Countless livelihoods destroyed, and the global economy has been plunged into its deepest recession since the Second World War. Even as we work to end this pandemic, and it's not over yet, we must learn the painful lessons it's teaching us and prepare for future health emergencies. The international health regulations provide a vital legal framework for responding to the global spread of disease. But the pandemic has exposed shortcomings in its application and implementation. In December, WHO member states made the historic decision to negotiate a new international instrument to strengthen pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. The resulting agreement, I hope, will better define what happens when an outbreak occurs and determine a global policy for equitable production and distribution of countermeasures. COVID-19 has taken so much from us, but it has also given us something, an opportunity to better prepare the world for future health emergencies. We must take that opportunity to build a safer future for all of us. I thank you. Kamsahamnida.
Excellency Park Jin, Foreign Minister of Korea. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, thank you for inviting me here today. This pandemic has taught us so many harsh lessons, but perhaps the most immediate one is that in terms of the potential for loss of life, disruption to society and livelihoods, and impact on economies, outbreaks of infectious disease pose one of the biggest and increasingly most likely threats to the global and economic security. In this context, the World Emerging Security Forum is both timely and pertinent. To start with, let me thank Korea's active participation in COVAX, a global risk-sharing mechanism for pooled procurement and equitable distribution of COVID-19 vaccines as part of the ACT Accelerator. Korea is one of the major contributors to COVAX, in particular to the GAVI COVAX Advanced Market Commitment, focusing on vaccine equity for lower-income countries. Korea's leadership and support have helped COVAX to protect hundreds of millions of the most vulnerable people from COVID and ensure that we are ready for future pandemic shocks. So far, COVAX has delivered over 1.5 billion doses of vaccine. The vast majority, more than 1.35 billion, have gone to people living in the 92 lower-income countries that otherwise would have struggled to get them. However, despite huge progress, with an average coverage of 48% with 2 doses in these countries as compared to a global average of around 60%, many countries, 17 at the last count, have still yet to protect 10% of their population with 2 doses. These are often fragile countries, and it's difficult to reach. So we have to think about this as not being just the last people to be reached, some of the hardest to reach, and in terms of future pandemic preparedness, one of our biggest blind spots. That is why COVAX is accelerating its country-centric approach to supporting countries with low coverage. Thanks to the ongoing support of the international community, including the Korean government, in April at the GAVI COVAX AMC Summit and at the COVID-19 Global Summit convened by the United States in May, we've made important progress towards not only ending the pandemic, but preparing for the next one too. And we are encouraged by the continuing commitments made by the global community. In this context, we do recognize the need for a global instrument to prepare and respond to future pandemics, and are supportive and engaged in the intergovernmental negotiating body process to develop a pandemic treaty. What we can contribute to today's discussion are the lessons learned and the experiences we can share from COVAX and more broadly with GAVI's engagement in fighting outbreaks such as Ebola, yellow fever, meningitis, and cholera routinely. Lessons from the current pandemic underscore the need to put equity and global solidarity at the center in any efforts to strengthen future pandemic preparedness and response. Because if we're not prepared to protect everyone, then we're not really prepared at all. Based on our 20-year-plus experience in advancing vaccine equity, GAVI would like to offer 4 suggestions toward the substantive elements of a new international instrument. First, we have to ensure rapid and agile contingency financing, such as through innovative financing mechanisms. This should support surge capacity and enable existing networks of global health agencies to orchestrate a rapid pivot when needed and mount a rapid and robust global response during a crisis. Second, we need to maintain the key and rapidly scalable innovations from COVAX, such as adapted regulatory frameworks, fair allocation mechanisms, as well as the necessary compensation, liability, and indemnification legal safety nets. Third, we have to diversify and expand manufacturing capacity in emerging economies so as to increase global vaccine supply security, including for pandemic vaccines when the need arises, whilst managing its impact on routine immunization. And fourth, we need to strengthen investments in routine immunizations and resilient primary health care with a focus on health system access for the most marginalized communities who are most at risk from outbreaks due to gender, geographic, and socioeconomic barriers. Whatever form future pandemic preparedness takes, we need to make sure that it does not create duplication or added layers of process that could slow down the response of the existing agencies. It also needs to build on and learn from COVAX's record, not just in making vaccines available to everyone, but in fostering the kind of global multilateralism that is needed to end a pandemic. The same level of global collaboration will be needed to prevent the next one. For these reasons, we need to be wary of reinventing the wheel. We look forward to working with you to create healthier, safer, and a more equitable world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's give them a big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much. Now we will commence the panel discussion. Today we are joined by Mr. Tarun Saluza, Head of Clinical Development at International Vaccine Institute. He will lead the session today, standing in for Dr. Ann Wurtel, who cannot join us today for health reasons. So please come up to the stage. And we're also joined by Mr. Ahmed Ogwal Oma, Acting Director of the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Please come up to the stage. Next, Mr. Yan Zhong Huang, a Senior Fellow for Global Health at the Council on Foreign Relations, are joining us today. Please come up to the stage. And last but not least, Ms. Baek Kyung-lan, Commissioner of Korea Disease Control and Prevention Agency, is also joining us today. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome our panelists onto the stage with a big round of applause. With that, I would like to pass the microphone over to Mr. Saluza. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So good evening. First of all, I would like to thank Ministry of Foreign Affairs for hosting this very timely and extremely important session on health security. And it's my pleasure and indeed privilege to moderate this session with world-renowned experts in the field. So I look forward to very productive conversation. So to start with, as we know, 2 years after the World Health Organization declared the outbreak of COVID-19 in January 2020 as a public health emergency of international concern, the world is still facing variant and cases of reinfection amid growing expectation of a possible transition from a pandemic to an endemic. Moreover, given the history and increasing frequency of health crises, it is anticipated that outbreaks of new transmittable diseases will occur periodically, requiring system-wide preparation on the part of the international public health architecture. Several problems and limitations that appeared in the global community's response to COVID-19 has led to increasing demand for the improvement of the global health security governance. These problems include inadequate sharing of information in the early stages, lack of readiness and resilience, shortcoming in public understanding and awareness, and despite the impressively fast development of effective vaccines, problem of inequity in their distribution and availability. From identification and early response during the initial stage of the outbreak to vaccine distribution, there is a consensus among nations on the need to strengthen global public health governance. And thus, negotiations have started in World Health Organization on the Global Pandemic Treaty. Based on lessons learned from the response to COVID-19, there is a growing recognition that Global Pandemic Treaty should include measures to improve global governance. In this regard, the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response recommendation to focus on improving rapid, flexible, and preventive responses in preparation for recurring and unexpected health security crises should be considered. In addition, it is necessary to enhance international cooperation in research and information to strengthen scientific evidence, which requires the cooperation of private sector with technologies for the development and production of vaccine and medicines. With this background, I would like to pose 4 questions to our esteemed panelists. The first question is, compared to past pandemic, what are the new global health governance related lessons learned from COVID-19? Second, what must be included in global pandemic treaty to make up for the limitations of global governance seen in response to past health crises, including COVID-19? Third, the international community has realized the importance of research cooperation and information sharing, capacity building for developing countries, and participation of private sector in fight against COVID-19. Based upon past experiences, how can international community engage the private sector in negotiation on the global pandemic treaty? And the last one, are there measures that can be agreed between governments outside the scope of the GPT to minimize and manage the economic and social consequences of a future pandemic so as to limit the social destabilization that often ensues from the pandemic? So let me start with Dr. Pak Kyung-ren, Commissioner, Korea Disease Control and Preventing Agency. Over to you, ma'am.
안녕하세요. 네, 안녕하세요. 백경란입니다.
Good afternoon, good evening. This is Baek Kyung-ran. Now, first of all, it is a great honor for me to be attending this World Emerging Security Forum. Yes, indeed, for the past 2 years, the world has been suffering from the COVID-19 pandemic, and it is not over. And now, we are now seeing the emergence of the monkeypox. And even today in Korea, now we also have had 2 cases coming into Korea just today. Now, the WHO, according to the IHR, is now reviewing whether the monkeypox is corresponding to the public health emergency of international concern or not. So they will be holding a meeting tomorrow to make this decision. And Korea is also very carefully scrutinizing the current situation. So now, regarding the vaccine, now we were able to develop the vaccine for pox, and were able to declare the end of it. And we were also able to develop many other vaccines, but still, the SARS or the new influenza, Zika virus, and the COVID-19, and now with the monkeypox, now they show that the humanity is still under the influence of recurring pandemic or infectious diseases. Now then, we need to look back to our experience of COVID-19 in responding to this pandemic so that we will be able to learn important lessons to prepare better for the future. Now, under the WTO, there was the independent panel, and then also the IHR review committee, and also the IPPR review report. And it is through these processes that they have looked back to the response to COVID-19 and also to shed light on the additional preparation that we need to make for the future. And as has been observed already several times, now the COVID-19 response centered on the WHO so far. So some of the limitations that we were able to identify is the need to have broader information sharing rapidly, and also to make sure that we are able to make the prediction about the spread of the infectious diseases early on, and also to make sure that we have the equitable allocation of the resources, including the masks and other protective equipment across the globe. So these were some of the things that we need to improve on based on the lessons learned so far. Now, I have also been part of the response committee in Korea, and I was also able to experience some of these limitations as well. Now, for the COVID-19 and also especially for the vaccines that have been newly developed, there was lack of information in the beginning, and also in the beginning of the vaccine availability, there were also some supply issues. So because of the supply shortage, we also had to think long and hard about how we are going to overcome the challenge. So I still remember vividly the experience that we had. And it was not limited to Korea. It was also the same in other countries, and also for some other governments or countries that had lesser financial resources, and also the countries that had lesser access to vaccines. I'm sure that they had even bigger suffering. So now these unfortunate situations, so this also calls for a collective effort for us to build up capacity across the globe, because that is something that we did not have during the early stages of COVID especially. And also we did not have the kind of system that would encompass both the public and the private sector in responding against the pandemic. So what we need is to look into the shortage of the necessary resources and the supplies, and to come up with ways to make sure that we will be able to have adequate supply. And again, we did not have this capacity, especially in the early days of COVID-19. Now, as Dr. Berkley has mentioned, COVID-19 has shown that infectious diseases know no borders, and no one is safe until everyone is safe. And for us to respond to this type of global infectious disease also requires global cooperation, because it is something that goes beyond an individual country's capacity. And this also means that we need to strengthen multilateral cooperation and coordination between the low-income countries, high-income countries, between civil society and the private sector. So actors in different sectors have to come together to work together. We also need to have the kind of governance to put them together and coordinate the different interests. And to make this possible, there is a proposal about a global pandemic treaty, and there is discussion underway on what would be the measures that would be effective in preventing or dealing with future pandemic. So this discussion is underway between the governments, and also there's discussion underway about what has to go into the global pandemic treaty, and I would like to make 5 suggestions related to that. Now, first is, in order to, so I believe that we need to come up with the solutions that would help us overcome the limitations that we have experienced in the early days of COVID-19. We need to make sure that there would be cooperation from and between governments to make sure that we will create the kind of environment that would make us be able to respond to the infectious diseases. So for example, the diagnostic systems or the different supplies that we need. So we need to come up with the kind of system for each region to build this system at an early day. Second, in order to implement these actions, we also need to come up with the necessary financial resources. Now, in order to make up for the limitations in the pandemic response, we need to have a periodic health status review, and the WHO should be able to provide periodic support to the vulnerable countries, and it is also this that has to be included in the pandemic treaty. And third, not only for the public sector or the government, but we also need to come up with ways to open up participation, and especially for the private sector, for them to take the initiative in this. As you would know, the vaccine for COVID-19 was able to be developed at a very rapid period, thanks to the long-standing development by the private sector in the mRNA sector, and also thanks to the civil society that had been providing support for this. So this means that the private sector will be able to, and they have been playing an important role in filling the gap in the healthcare sector that has been left by the government. Now, for the Act A that has supported the supply of necessary items and vaccine for COVID-19. Now, this is also a good example of a public-private partnership that has participation by not only only the government, but also other private groups like CEPI. And I understand that there is going to be an opportunity to broaden the participation by the private sector as we continue to have this discussion. And fourth is, now we see that many of the diseases, like the monkeypox, are transmitted between animals and humans. So given this, and also given the fact that these diseases can also become pandemic, we also need to include this provision in the Global Pandemic Treaty as well. And last but not least, in order to create and generate the data that is generated during the pandemic, we also need to build the database to a global database to build and store this type of data. And we also need to work together to foster the necessary human resources in this field. Now, for Korea, we are planning to provide support to the low and middle income countries to enhance their vaccine development capability by working together with the WHO. And we will also continue to encourage private sector participation in this field as well. Now, given the time today, I believe that it is ripe for us to come up with alternative means to globally deal against pandemic. As we continue our discussion for the Global Pandemic Treaty, Korea will also actively participate in the Global Pandemic Treaty discussion and will continue to be an active participant in trying to promote the global healthcare system throughout the world. And Korea has also hosted a related, so we are planning to host a related meeting in this to have high-level ministerial talk about the global health security. So we will continue to play an active role in enhancing the global healthcare security and governance throughout the world. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Kyung, for sharing your experience of Korea and contribution of Korea toward capacity building for low and middle income countries. Now I would turn to Dr. Yang Hong Huang, Senior Fellow for Global Health Council on Foreign Relations, for his views, please.
Thank you, and also thanks to Korean Minister of Foreign Affairs to invite me over to attend this important forum. And it's a great opportunity to meet a stellar group of experts and practitioners in the field. So for the first question on the lessons learned, right, and also in terms of what makes this pandemic different from previous ones, I can only highlight maybe two important developments. The first is what I call the politicization, right? That is when the world is responding to the pandemic at both the national and the global level, we are framing it as, at the international level, a competition between democracies and authoritarian countries. That, in a way, poisoned, as Dr. Smith pointed out in the previous session, this atmosphere for international cooperation, right? Let me give you the example, right? We know that China, for example, represents one of the biggest risk factors in responding and preparing for pandemics. But this politicization, framing the pandemic response as a competition between two political systems, literally means that Western countries, when they're planning for preparing for the next pandemic, actually excluding China from the conversation, right, on pandemic preparation. That is unfortunate. It is also incoherent because, again, we know, right, dealing with a global challenge, we need a global solution. You cannot just exclude any country, not to mention a country but that has so much leverage and size like China. Right? And secondly, that's in terms of politicization. Again, this is the first time, right, that ideology has entered, right? The global response to a pandemic. That means when we're talking about, right, this origins probe that is investigating the origins of the pandemic, because of these political factors, political stakes are so high, it makes it very difficult, right, for countries like China to be fully cooperative, right, in the pandemic probe. That is explained why after more than 2.5 years, we still have no clue where this pandemic is from. How did it start it? Right? This is rather unfortunate. It's very different from the previous ones, where we, even for the epidemic like SARS, right, after 13 years, we still were able to identify the etiological agent of the epidemic. And the second problem also that is different from the previous pandemics, that this is the first time we are seeing, right, this pandemic is being framed as a national or international security by so many countries. So when we're talking about securitization, essentially means we frame the issue as an existential threat that requires emergency, extraordinary response, from the states. That leads to what we consider by the containment-based approach, try to contain the spread of the virus. But as we later found, right, because that virus is so transmissible, right, so contagious, it is very difficult, right, to contain its spread, not to mention to eliminate, right, the virus. So how to make complete that shift from securitization and desecuritization when by the landscape of the virus spread has changed. I think that is also a challenge we have to deal with. We're seeing by some countries like China continue to stick with that zero COVID strategy, right? That instead of shifting to a mitigation-based approach that focuses on severe, reducing severe cases and death. So I think securitization presents another challenge, to the global society. And the second question is the pandemic treaty. How what provisions should be included in terms of global governance. I think the new pandemic treaty, which we expected that it's going to be under negotiation in the coming years, will have to address the issue of inequality and adopt a rights-based approach, right, in dealing with the governance issues as far as the pandemic preparation is concerned. Because as Dr. Seth Berkley talked about, right, this is not acceptable, right, in terms of vaccine distribution, right? It's not that we don't have enough vaccines. We have enough vaccine. Now we even have an oversupply of vaccines, just including by the Western countries, right, and Chinese vaccines. It's like more than 11 billion doses, right, annual manufacturing capacity. Right? The problem is how to get the vaccines distributed in an equal and effective, efficient manner. Right? The second problem is the issue of sovereignty. Right? Again, in terms of the distribution of the vaccines and the therapeutic means, right? That initially, we had that problem of vaccine nationalism. High-income countries stockpile the vaccines for their own population, right, to the detriment of low-income countries. Right? We know that for low-income countries, even today, I think until last month, right, only 11% of the population there, right, have been vaccinated with 2 doses. the sovereignty is a challenge also to global governance, and the third challenge is just to come to me this morning. I think this pandemic treaty needs to have the articles that deal with the multiple crises associated with the pandemic, right? So by multiple crises, I'm talking about the pandemic itself is a crisis multiplier, right? Exacerbated the food security crisis, exacerbated the supply chain problem. But in the meantime, I think the pandemic treaty should also consider, right, how they can devise institutions and norms to handle contingency developments, right? Like, this Russia invasion of Ukraine, we have never thought of that is going to happen during the pandemic, but we do know, right, that this invasion sucked the oxygen, right, from the global pandemic response, now in terms of funding, in terms of the commitment. So, that presents another problem for pandemic preparedness and planning. The third question about how the role of the private sector in research cooperation and information sharing, right? If we agree that better preparation for the pandemic needs early detection and rapid response, right? Then I think private sector can play a very significant role here, right? First, we need the private sector to help, right? To do better surveillance and monitoring of new variants and new pathogens. Government labs could be very important, right, to do the job. But in the meantime, we know that the governments, right, because of the concerns about, the economy, about, social political stability, they have the tendency to downplay, right, the seriousness of the crisis, especially in the beginning stage of the crisis. So the private sector, including, right, the private labs, that they could play an important role in disease surveillance. I was just having a conversation with the head of the pandemic preparedness defense coalition, who's worked at Abbott. I was told that Abbott, which is a pharmaceutical firm in the U.S., they have been on this, doing this global surveillance, right, since 1984. So the private sector could indeed be mobilized to do effective disease surveillance, but they could, of course, play a much bigger role in the second the aspect, that is early development and rapid deployment of scalable and quality, right, diagnostic tools, vaccines, and therapeutic means, right, targeting the new pathogens that have pandemic potential, right? So I don't need to belabor how important, right, these institutions, the private sector is, right? The Moderna, right? The Pfizer, this is so important, right, in helping, right, developing effective vaccines, right, and therapeutic means in responding to the pandemic. And finally, the issue of how to mitigate and minimize the impacts of the pandemic. I think that's also a very important issue, because here, when we talk about pandemic response, I sensed this certain detachment here. That is, our focus tends to be on the direct impact of the pandemic, on the infections, the cases, the number of deaths, the mortality, right? But I think more attention, at least equal attention should be paid to the social economic impacts of the crises. We talk about how to coordinate international travel, right? How to make our supply chain more resilient, right, to avoid this disruption caused by the pandemic, and also the issue of disinformation and misinformation associated with the pandemic, what WHO consider the infodemics. These are all the impacts of the pandemic. But I think norms and institutions should be developed to deal with these challenges as well, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Huang. Thanks for your insightful comments, and very beautifully you touched how the global solution should be proposed for the global threat. Vaccine equity, vaccine nationalism should be avoided, and other geopolitical crises do have impact on the pandemic as well, and the role of the private institution, how can they play a big role in surveillance and diagnostics. And of course, impact of the issue, other impacts like socio-economical, political and security crises. Thank you so much for your views. Now I would request Dr. Ahmed Ogwel Oma, Acting Director, Africa CDC, to share his comment, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea for inviting Africa CDC to participate in this second edition of the World Emerging Security Forum. Very timely, particularly now during this pandemic and as other health security issues become more evident. Let me start with the lessons that we've learned in Africa. Very sadly, the first lesson we learned is that when there is a global crisis, Africa is literally on its own. It's not a bad thing, by the way, to be on your own, but that's a sad reality that when there is a global crisis, we are on our own, and we unfortunately had to learn that in the middle of a pandemic. Part of the reason for that lesson is another lesson, that global multilateralism doesn't really work very well in a crisis. It works when the crisis is in one corner of the world, but it doesn't work very well when the crisis is global in nature. All the multilateral instruments that were put in place to be able to address emergencies like the COVID pandemic have one after the other systematically failed the continent of Africa. The last was a few days ago when the WTO Council met and passed a resolution that, for all intents and purposes, did not respond to the reason why the TRIPS flexibilities were negotiated over many painful years, and the reason why that kind of instrument was put in place in the WTO environment. These instruments of multilateralism have not worked for us on the continent. The third lesson we learned was a much happier lesson, and that is that African solidarity comes through when we are left on our own and when the multilateral instruments are not functioning well for us. The solidarity on the continent came through. To date, the heads of states of the African region have met 23 times at least to discuss various crises. The COVID pandemic has been at the core of those conversations, provide guidance and leadership when the global leadership was challenged. That solidarity was not only at the heads of states level, but it also was evident amongst our ministers and amongst our technical cadre, whether it was at the leadership level or whether it was in the field, indeed even the public. That solidarity came through, and it succeeded in the low numbers that we've seen in Africa. In the beginning of this pandemic, there were predictions of huge numbers of deaths. I think the models didn't take into consideration African solidarity. And the numbers have remained low, and we are trying our very best to keep them low. The fourth lesson we learned is when we become innovative, then we break down the challenges of access to countermeasures, particularly. We established the Africa Medical Supplies Platform when it was very difficult to get even test kits in the beginning. PPEs were next to impossible to come across. I'll not speak about vaccines at the moment, but those not only came late, they came very late. But by being innovative and providing ourselves with avenues of accessing these countermeasures and the tools we needed to handle the pandemic, we succeeded. The Africa Medical Supplies Platform was a very important conduit of countermeasures for many countries on the continent when purchasing on the open market became literally impossible. The Africa Vaccines Acquisition Task Team, now Africa Vaccines Acquisition Trust, was the vehicle that came through when the COVAX facility found it a challenge to be able to provide vaccines to the continent because their supply could not be able to deliver for Africa. We became innovative in many ways, including the ways in which we handled the pandemic at country level. We used our community health workers instead of technology that many parts of the world were using. We repurposed our health workers, including those who are about to graduate, so that we had enough knowledgeable people on the ground to be able to handle public expectations, the number of those who required clinical management, indeed those who were hospitalized, even those who passed away and we needed to engage them at the mental health level. It worked because we became innovative. The fifth lesson we learned is health security is an ongoing activity. You don't do it because of the pandemic and then you stop. It has to continue throughout. And that is why, as Africa, we have decided that it's only under a new public health order that we can be able to address issues of health security, not just on the continent, we believe globally as well. We can't go on doing things as they were being done before because those former plans, structures, global architecture are not working the way they were supposed to be working. Sixth, and in fact it's a good example now that we have monkeypox being considered as a public health emergency of international concern. We've had monkeypox on the continent since 1970. During this pandemic, we've had over 10,500 cases. We have sought vaccines to be able to protect our frontline health workers. It has not yet met the criteria for a public health emergency of international concern. 10,500 cases plus, over 460 deaths, and still it doesn't meet the criteria. Now that cases are being found elsewhere in the world, there's conversation that now we can look at monkeypox as a public health emergency of international concern. That instrument too has failed when it comes to an African situation when we are talking about monkeypox. We can't do things the same, otherwise we will not get different results. On the issue of the pandemic treaty, the way we approach this discussion of the pandemic treaty is to look at the current instruments. Are they working or are they not working? And if they are not working, I mean, if you wanted to cross the city of Seoul and it takes you 3-4 hours to do that, you don't look for another vehicle to cross the city faster. You have to look for a different kind of instrument, a different kind of vehicle to shorten that journey. You don't use the same vehicle, however more beautiful it may be. It will not take you less time because you'll be using the same infrastructure. A new global legal instrument. What will it do if the current legal global instruments are failing? At least for us in Africa, they are. So when we look at that discussion, we reflect on our lessons, and there are a few things that we feel must be accommodated in any new legal instrument. The first is rapid sharing of information. If we don't share information rapidly, and I think IHR has been very clear that there are huge gaps there in as far as information sharing is concerned. If we don't address that, the new legal instruments will still not work. Second is the immediate availability of countermeasures as a public good. We've all said that if one part is not safe, the rest of the world is not safe. If countermeasures are not made available quickly, efficiently, and immediately within this new global pandemic treaty, it will not work. Third is speed. Whatever has been agreed, the instrument must accommodate the need for speed. If it is not speedy, then it will not work. 2 years down the line, we are still considering whether monkeypox is a public health emergency of international concern or not, yet Africa has lost 460 people. Over 10,000 have been diagnosed with this particular illness. If there is no speed, it will not work. Finally is that treaty must, and this is a minimum for us in Africa, it must accommodate regional action. At the regional level, we must be able to declare a public health emergency, and we must be able to take action at the regional level. We don't have to wait for 2 years for consideration of a public health emergency if it is affecting the continent, if it's affecting a particular region of the world. If regional action is not accommodated in the treaty, it will not work. Finally, the last two questions, I'll bundle them together because they're very related. The private sector is part of us. We are the private sector. Without us, there will be no private sector. We are the market. And that's another lesson we've learned, that private sector must address issues of health security, because without health security, there'll be no or very little trade. There'll be very little economic activities. So their activities will also not be able to thrive. The enterprises will not be able to grow. So the private sector must be part of the public discussion that we are talking about. And although governments have the responsibility of incentivizing the private sector to be able to address a public good, it is in the interest of the private sector that health security is good, that disease threats have been secured quickly so that you can be able to go on with your economic activities. So the private sector should not be thinking only of profits. The bigger incentive is that there is a market for them to be able to trade in tomorrow. In this way, research and development of different countermeasures that we require, availing those tools to the public so they can be able to be used rapidly, is absolutely critical. And private sector should not be looked at as different from public, because we are all part of the same community. Finally, let me emphasize that health security, in our view, is actually national security. And national security is what will translate into global security. If there is a break in health security, there will be a break in national security and therefore global security. And there is no way that we are able to disinvest in health security if we want to remain secure at national and global levels. from Africa, we are convinced that the only way for us to be able to achieve health security and therefore national and global security is to implement what we are calling the new public health order, where each region must be able to take care of its own priorities in a fast and efficient way, and all countermeasures that are required, all tools that are required to be able to prepare and respond are made available efficiently, quickly, and equitably. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for the holistic overview of the problem and suggesting for potential solution, and especially highlighting when it comes to inequity, and that too in African subcontinent. We all agree that be it public, private, state, non-state actor, each one have their own strength and weaknesses. Maybe it's time to leverage each other's strength, complement each other, and come up with the global solution. Maybe now I will move to the next round of questions. So the first question to all panelists is, when we talk about lessons learned, we have seen that even the developed countries struggle to combat the pandemic despite very high ranking on Global Health Security Index. And when it comes to developing countries, it's much more complicated due to limited capacity in terms of infrastructures, training. So do you see technology playing pivotal role in bridging the capacity gap? So what is the role of each stakeholder here? So maybe I would request Dr. Kyung-Dun to start with.
Well, that was such a tough question. So of course, in order to overcome those issues and challenges, of course, we would have to work hard. But then, and of course, in trying to overcome the pandemic, I do believe that the technology in this case did make a big contribution. And even before it became a pandemic. Now, I believe that we need to focus more on the pandemic preparedness. Now, Dr. Oma also mentioned that, of course, at the regional level, so a regional issue, regional problem could escalate into a global problem. So we also have to focus more on providing support to the different regions. So we need to have the kind of global mechanism to provide regional support. So for example, the vaccine or the diagnostic kits that we developed, I believe that those were also based on the efforts that have been built up so far. So what we need to do is share the technology and also try to help other countries so that other countries can also build up their infrastructure. Perhaps they can also import the effective infrastructure from other countries. In other words, we need to help each other out.
Thank you very much. So Dr. Huang, would you like to add? Yes, please.
Sure, yeah. You know, I agree with Dr. Pak that technology does play a very important role in the pandemic response. You know, we are actually seeing this may be also something that is different from the previous pandemics and epidemics, is that we are seeing how, right, that we can develop effective vaccine in such a short period of time, right? Because initially, when we talk about vaccine development, it takes, right, at least like 2 years, right, to develop an effective vaccine. But this time, just like a month, you know, for us to develop an effective mRNA vaccine, right, to tackle the crises, you know, which, you know, I believe, you know, saved millions of lives. But in the meantime, you know, I want to point out technology, right? It cannot. But this is what we call the technological medical model, right? In terms of the approaches to global governance, right? It is not the final solution to the problem, because let's again talk about this vaccine development. It's precisely why this technology is so sophisticated, right? So efficient, right, in developing the vaccine, that also encouraged, right, this vaccine skepticism, right? People refuse to get vaccinated because they, this vaccine is developed so quickly, right? Because, you know, used to take 2 years, now only like 5-6 months, there must be something wrong with the vaccine, right? So this issue of misinformation, disinformation, actually can be highlighted by the technological development, that should be, again, addressed, as a governance challenge. In the meantime, I want to point it out, there are other, right, the issues, but that not necessarily, right, related to technology that I think are equally important, right? You mentioned this, like developer countries, even though they really were ranked high in the Global Health Security Index, but they failed, right, miserably, right, in responding to this pandemic. So there are issues of public messaging, there are issues of complacency, there are issues of health system, capacity that are all built into this process. We are now talking about reforming the U.S. CDC to make it more efficient and effective in responding to health crises in the future. So this cannot be addressed by technology alone, of course.
Thank you very much. So, Dr. Omar, I have a leading question with that. So, as he said that there was a lot of misinformation. But we say that there was wrong use of technology, let's say social media. There was mistrust among the community. So we have seen, particularly in African countries, even if vaccines were available, there was or still there is very low uptake. And the coverage in few countries in Africa is even less than 10%. So how could we build the trust among communities and ensure their voices are heard and concerns are addressed? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And allow me to, the first very provocative question, I would like to touch on that a bit and link it into the second one. And I say provocative because the Global Health Security Index has given very high rating for some countries that have got huge challenges with a global health security issue like the pandemic. So in my view, and this is personal, it's not Africa CDC, is we need to look at the Global Health Security Index again. It's giving us the wrong figures, and the pandemic has shown that it needs to be reformed. It is one of those that when it is reformed, then we can be able to get a better balance of what a country's actual rating should be. When we link that to technology, for me, technology needs to make things simpler. If technology is making things more complicated, it is not useful. If technology is not addressing the immediate challenges, it is not useful. So there is space for technology, but only when it makes things simpler. Low uptake in Africa, that is true. The important thing is to address why there's low uptake of COVID-19 vaccines on the continent. And three things stand out. One is the vaccines arrived very late. And like all of you know, when you stay hungry for a very long time, however beautiful the meal comes, if you've been there hungry for so long, it's no longer as interesting as it was. Maybe you figure out a way of not feeling so hungry after a while. And this is what has happened on the continent. Vaccines came late, and then they came in huge numbers that did not make, frankly, any sense to a system that had already been starved of the vaccines. The public started wondering, do we really need the vaccines? Not that they don't want vaccines, but if it has come so late and they are seeing the numbers are sort of under control, it becomes a very big, so this is one thing, the lateness of the vaccines arriving. Second is the system for adult vaccination on the continent. Most of the vaccination being done on the continent is to children, not to adults. African adults, most of them, they go out to earn on a daily basis. If you don't go out to earn, you will not be able to eat. So when I wake up, I have the choice of either I queue up to get my vaccine and I miss my daily income, or I go and I look for my daily income. the choice is a no-brainer. The vast majority will go out and look for their daily income. And where we have gone and taken vaccination to where the public are, in the markets, in the religious places, in the schools, they actually are taking the vaccine. So it is not classical hesitation. It is just prioritization in terms of the timing of the vaccines actually being available. And finally, is the infrastructure that is in place to be able to push out the vaccines to adults has not matured yet on the continent. And most of our systems on the continent are so health facility based, and the health facilities are few. If I am a farmer somewhere and I have to take transport for an hour, pay $1 there and back, and I'm earning the $1 for the day, it's not a very good option for me to be able to travel and then spend all my income for the day on transportation to go and get vaccines. So that model for adult vaccination is not yet developed in that way. And these are the three things that stand out why there's low uptake on the continent. But that is going to change because we are designing new methodologies of getting vaccines to members of the public. But for me, the Global Health Security Index needs to be reformed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed. And very beautifully, you pointed out that it's not a question of priority rather than, it's a question of priority rather than of hesitancy when it comes to the low vaccine uptake. If there are any questions from the audience, we will be happy to take. Meanwhile, I would like to have a question with Dr. Kyung again. So Dr. Kyung, we know that the re-emerging virus, now like monkeypox, is expanding in many countries. Given that it will take time to reach an agreement on global pandemic treaty, which measure should be taken by all stakeholders, including the governments in their places in the short term? So what do you see, what should be the short-term solution?
Well, as the moderator has just mentioned, yes, the global pandemic treaty with involvement by many different countries is bound to take some time because of the nature of the discussion. So then what we need is perhaps a smaller scale agreement among the smaller number of countries or at a region to strengthen the pandemic readiness in the region. So for example, it was mentioned earlier by Dr. Oma how the African solidarity was very effective and successful. Now, right now in Asia, so building early warning system and also to having a stockpile of emergency medical supplies. So there are discussions starting to be ready for a future pandemic. And also through such regional support architecture, each country can strengthen their commitment to abide by the standards in preparing against pandemic. And based on that, we can also find further ways of helping out each other. So I believe that that could also be one way of preparing against the pandemic in the future. For example, having joint training or joint exercises or joint training for the human resources of the different countries. Perhaps if we can build such human resources, it can also be helpful in having collective response against pandemic.
Thank you very much. So, Dr. Huang, would you like to add?
Sure. I think, well, given that it takes years to complete the negotiations for the pandemic treaty, and of course, we can't wait until the pandemic, the treaty is negotiated to start the response to the monkeypox. And I think about, I'm not an epidemiologist, but I think in order to have an effective response, we need to first have a clear idea, right, what the epidemiological characteristics of the disease. Right? We know that is a disease that is not going to spread so easily because it is spread through close contact. and it's also confined to a certain segment of the population. So, first we need to evaluate whether that disease has indeed the potential for pandemic spread. And secondly, I think it is very important to build the global networks, cooperating, international cooperation to closely track the disease spread. So effective global surveillance would be very important, right, to get a clear idea, right, the trajectory of the virus, of the disease, its ability, right, to evolve, right, in the and the potential to develop into a more dangerous, pathogen. And so it is at this moment, I think effective global surveillance would be the key.
Thank you very much. So, Dr. Uma, what could be the immediate solution or short-term solution?
Regionalize emergency preparedness and response. Regionalize emergency preparedness and response. And let me add here that it's only yesterday that, today early morning, Korea time, that our health ministers adopted the recommendation that going forward, Africa is going to be able to make its own public health emergency pronouncements, and using that, then we can be able to mobilize and respond. If you don't regionalize it, the global negotiations, as we argue about where the comma should be and the full stop should end, will take months. And we don't have months. Another virus is going to hit us very soon. So regionalize emergency preparedness and response, and let neighbors take care of each other as the globe continues the negotiation. And it is very important to negotiate at the global level, but the speed at which we need to act, we need to regionalize emergency preparedness and response.
Thank you very much. So what you are essentially saying is the local capacity building should be prioritized. Thank you very much. So if there are no questions from the floor, maybe, okay, let me ask the last question to Dr. Uma itself. So as we know, pandemic adversely affect all the lives on the planet. So what are your thoughts on the need for a stronger international health framework when it comes to One Health approach, that is connecting the health of humans, animals, and our planet? Over to you.
No, thank you. This is essential for the global architecture, for the regional architecture, for the national architecture. It is essential at the community level as well. If we don't approach this from a One Health perspective, we will not be able to cover all the gaps that we need. One Health approach is essential to whichever new architecture we are developing, national, regional, or global.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So I think the message is very clear from the panelists that there is an urgent need to strengthen national, regional, and global capacities and resilience to future pandemic. And we do hope that the global health governance through Global Pandemic Treaty will ensure that benefit of the preventive and response intervention like vaccine will be realized by rich and poor alike. Thank you very much for the interesting session. Thank you. Over to you, Jessica.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give them another big round of applause. Thank you so much. And ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the session 2 on health security. And we will have the last session, session 3, Emerging Technologies and Security, under the theme of Future of Global Governance on Emerging Technologies, from 8:10 p.m. Korean Standard Time. So ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy a short break and please come back at 8:10 p.m. Korean Standard Time. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the 2022 World Emerging Security Forum. Now it's time to begin the last session of the 2022 WESF. Before we begin the session 3, thank you for staying with us until the very end. So now, ladies and gentlemen, we will begin the session 3, Emerging Technologies and Security, under the theme of Future Global Governance on Emerging Technologies. On the session 3, as we did before, we would like to have 2 keynote speeches, and then we will have a panel discussion followed by a Q&A session. During the session, those who are joining us online, you could leave any of your comments or questions in the chat box of your YouTube platform. And participants here at the site, please send us your questions through the QR code on our forum leaflet. Thank you very much for your kind cooperation, ladies and gentlemen. So with that, we would like to begin the keynote speech. First keynote speech will be delivered by Mr. Young Son, a chairman of the board at Harman and a former CEO of Samsung Electronics. He has sent us very meaningful pre-recorded video. Now, please join me in welcoming him. Let's give a big round of applause.
Hello, I'm Young Son, former corporate president and chief strategy officer of Samsung Electronics. Now I'm founding managing partner of World in Catalyst, a venture capital firm based in Silicon Valley, investing in early stage companies around the world. This includes new business stack and privacy enhanced computation. It's a pleasure to speak to you at the World Emerging Security Forum about confidential compute and open source architecture in the context of cybersecurity. Today, we are dealing with 4 key risks, namely COVID-19, chips, cyber, and cloud. COVID-19 was unexpected and tested global collaboration and resiliency. And I feel we made a really good progress, collaboration among the scientists, and being able to develop vaccines in a very short time. Chips is something that people didn't really think about. Maybe people were thinking potato chips at one point. But chips, semiconductors, are truly a global manufacturing effort. The supply chain has been tested big time, given the new geopolitical reality, as well as a number of disruptions around different policies around issues, and increasing demand at home, at work, as well as automobiles and other products that has been requiring pandemic demands, shutdown, and then being able to come out, we had the real issues around managing the signal. Regarding the cloud, all apps are going from on-prem to cloud, and this brings different degree of cybersecurity and privacy challenges. The explosion of data created in recent years has left organizations facing many challenges on how to store, how to process, and analyze this data while maintaining security. Due to the rapid digitalization, and in many ways due to pandemic, remote working become norm, and the evolution of AI and ML, which requires real-time access to the cloud data, has led to an increased risk of attacks. According to Gartner, by 2025, 60% of large organizations will use one or more privacy-enhancing computation techniques in analytics, business intelligence, or cloud computing. And by the end of 2023, 75% of the world population will have its personal data covered under modern privacy regulations. As a result, we have seen substantial growth of computational computing. Many of you may not know what is confidential compute. Confidential computing is the protection of data in use, using hardware-based trust execution environments, which is an environment that isolates data and code to prevent unauthorized access, even when the infrastructure itself is compromised. This provides assurance of data integrity, confidentiality, and helps enterprise secure their data while currently using in their systems. For example, during processing or runtime, Enterprise can run sensitive applications on public cloud or other hosted environments without the fear their data is vulnerable and exposed. Previously, privacy solutions in the cloud were only available to protect data at rest or in transit. Cloud providers offered encryption service to protect data in storage and databases, and data moving over a network connection in transit. Confidential computing overcame the remaining data security weakness by protecting data in use in real time during processing or runtime. As we're working remote, this is becoming a real issue. Everybody's working from different environment, different runtimes. How do you make sure and how do you ensure that this data is secure? We see three key drivers contributing to this growth in confidential computing. One is really about increasing spending in cloud. More than half of data is in the cloud today, and increasing the spending on data security to address that. And then obviously the most important item is also about using artificial intelligence and ML for business intelligence. And that's also increasing demand for this type of applications. At World Catalyst, my venture firm, we see the value that confidential computation brings by unlocking the value in data without compromising privacy or regulatory needs. Large amounts of sensitive data, including personal data, trade secrets, or data protected through regulators are locked to data analytics and machine learning in many ways for good purpose of protecting you. But it incurs huge overhead and it takes the large risk. Use cases for some of confidential computes are really about being able to use data across silos of different applications and different departments for fraud analytics, health data exchange, or better insight for medical discovery by being able to exchange information. Such highly sensitive data requires data sharing without compromising data privacy and security. One of innovation is really about bringing hardware and software working together. Trusted execution environments provide a dedicated, secure hardware, usually semiconductor-based processing environment that's isolated from the rest of the system with a secure, encrypted access to data in memory in real time. This technology has many advantages. However, trusted execution environment lacks a highly efficient data stack that can deeply integrate into business intelligence and machine learning workflows. We believe this is a core area of innovation where companies like OPAC, where we have invested, are focusing. OPAC is based on open source compute. It's a platform company focusing on extracting business intelligence and machine learning on sensitive data by making confidential computation as easy as traditional computation in public cloud. It combines disruptive data stack for frictionless analytics and machine learning and scale out on trusted zones and open source community support. We see use case from all entities holding confidential data. In particular, the financial services and healthcare market. Large enterprises have data silos and they need to combine those silos to get an insight around what's going on in an organization without achieving compliance with the privacy regulations that requires innovation. We have seen multiple benefits from the open source model. Adoption from open source solutions can help define problem statement from industry to drive improved product development by aggregating different ideas from different sources. We continue to see great potential in open source models and great value in privacy solutions, including confidential computing, which provide missing piece of data, security vulnerabilities. With open community, with the global community, we can build even better security together. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today.
Thank you very much. And next, we will have a keynote speech delivered by Mr. Dan Smith, a director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, who will also lead a panel discussion after his keynote speech. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome him onto the stage. And we are also joined by Ms. Rosanne Canizo, Assistant Director at the Center for Strategic Studies and Simulation of the United Service Institution of India. So please come up to the stage and let's welcome her with a big round of applause. Thank you. And we're also joined by Mr. Rowan Geis, Director of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. And we're also joined by Ms. Kriti Sharma, founder of AI for Good UK online in real time as well. Thank you once again for your participation. With that, I would like to pass the microphone over to Mr. Dan Smith for keynote speech. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And as you can see, I'm multitasking. First of all, I do the keynote speech, and then I change personality and become the moderator for this session. And I know it's going to be a really interesting conversation, the future of global governance on emerging technologies. I'd like to again express my thanks to the Republic of Korea Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with whom CIPRI has played some role in partnering on this this conference. We've been very pleased to be able to help out, and I'm very honored to have been asked to be moderating this session. I'm also honored that so many of you have actually stayed through to what we in the business tend to refer to as the graveyard session. Very pleased to see you all here, and I hope that despite that terminology, we managed to make it a lively discussion. Now, what I thought I would start with is a little bit of, from my point of view, topic definition. And I think that you will see immediately not incompatibilities or contradictions at all with what the previous speaker was just saying, but simply different perspectives, understanding this topic from different directions. And I think it's a very important part of the conversation to be able to understand that this is such a big and multidimensional issue that in some ways we're all like, you know, the group of people with blindfolds on trying to describe an elephant by touch. And it feels like a completely different creature depending on whether you're touching the tusk or the trunk or the body or the hoof or the tail. And so we need to bear that in mind, that this issue looks different depending on your starting point. So from where I am, I start to think about, well, what are the technologies that we're discussing? And I look at the importance of artificial intelligence, including machine learning. I think about the possible impact of quantum computing, which I've got to confess I don't understand at all. I'll come back to my lack of understanding later on in this talk. There's the whole question of cyber security and the cyberspace, and connected to that, the physical geography of what we call cyberspace, both in land-based installations and in, of course, in outer space, that a large part of cyberspace really is outer space. There's the issue of 3D printing, additive manufacturing. There's the question of biotechnologies as well, that all fits into this area. So those are the kind of the technological challenges, areas, categories that we're thinking about. But we need also to be subdividing this issue into arenas, because these different technologies raise different questions in different arenas. One of them that is very close to what I, as director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, am thinking about a lot, is the interstate, the international arena, where you might be raising questions, for example, about the relationship between artificial intelligence and strategic stability. That artificial intelligence sort of emerging into the arms race has a contradictory impact. The speeding up of calculations and of information flow is problematic, I think, on the weapons side and the armament side, but it is potentially helpful on the arms control and disarmament side. So there's this dual aspect to it. There are further issues as well. I mean, there's the whole question, for example, of, in relation to cybersecurity, what in some some quarters is known as left-of-launch hacking. That's to say, hacking into systems that are related to the control of missiles pre-launch and interfering in that process. So that's the interstate arena, raising some challenges in the traditional kind of strategic security field. There's also, of course, the intrastate arena, the whole question of the impact that these technologies have on politics, political management, political relations, but also on daily life within countries, within societies. I often take as an example of this a statistic which I picked up a few years ago, so it's probably out of date now, and today would be an even more striking one. But when I learned it 3 or 4 years ago, the question was, how often does the average Swede visit her or his bank? We don't carry cash. We have credit cards or phones. We do all of our banking online. So the answer to the question is the average Swede visited 3 or 4 years ago was visiting their bank physically once every 7 years. Now, compared to, when I first had a bank account, and I was regularly writing to my bank, I was visiting my bank, I was going to more, there were so many branches and so on. So life has changed. Now, as the banks have gone online and as it's all become cyber, I mean, that introduces new areas of vulnerability as well as new areas of efficiency and convenience. And then there's the question, again, cross-cutting through these categories and these arenas of the techniques and the instruments which are used. And I suppose I would focus on 3, but I'm very interested to know if others see more. I mean, I would think about sabotage, and I would think of 3 S's: sabotage, spying, and subterfuge. Subterfuge being, in a sense, another word for information warfare. So how do we think about governance of this very complex set of technology or issues, technologies, arenas, and techniques and instruments? The Commission on Global Governance in 1995, which was a sort of international effort, probably rather social democratic and green in its colouring, given the personalities who were on this Global Commission, came up with what I think was a relatively useful shorthand definition of governance, that it is the sum of the many ways in which individuals and institutions, both public and private, manage their common affairs. So, for me, important parts of that are many ways. There's a diversity of modes and mechanisms within this thing that we call governance. Governance is not just one thing. That it's at many levels. It's individuals and institutions, and presumably we can say of all scales. That it's public and it's private. And it's about common affairs. It's about our relations with each other. So it's international and it's local, it's about law, it's about norms, it's universal, it's sectoral, it's cross-cutting and it's narrow and segmented, it's diverse and it's suiting the arena. We could be thinking of it in terms of human rights law and privacy, we could be thinking of it in terms of corporate law and best corporate practice and accountancy regulations, we could be thinking about it in terms of international humanitarian law, which is what used to be known as the laws of war. So, how do we, what's some general thoughts about managing the challenge posed by emerging technologies? What I want to say is that in approaching this topic, I certainly feel a considerable amount of humility. First of all, the humility is because, as I said before, I don't really know very much. I mean, I'm the guy who swears at the computer in the belief that there's a little person inside that if I can kind of convince them or persuade them or just yell them into submission, that the computer will start to behave itself. I'm the guy who, faced with something going wrong, thinks, oh, I'll do the technical thing, and I press the restart button. I use the computer a lot. I use it every day. I've got a computer with me on this trip. I've got a little tablet for making my notes. I've got 2 phones with me. I use the technology a lot. Right? I have very little understanding of that technology. What I can see in terms of governance is that there has been some progress and there's been some interesting discussions, but you know, we're still calling it emerging technologies, and how long does it take? This is a 3-decade-plus discussion already, which is going on. There's been some progress, but has there really been enough over those 3 decades in terms of governance, in terms of being able to govern these new spaces, these new challenges which we've created for ourselves? The discussion indeed moves much more slowly than the development of technologies. Technological speed is way, way ahead of the speed of policy. And that, I think, is a major issue. I think another problem that we need to be thinking about is the kind of the black box syndrome, that machine learning creates impermeable and incomprehensible systems that are impermeable and incomprehensible even to the one who designed that particular piece of software. So these are deep challenges indeed. And the further problem is something that I was referring to earlier in the special session which we had on the environment of peace. You know, governance, international governance, is in a pretty bad way. $500 billion of tax goes astray every year. 64% of the ocean surface is in what are called the ABNJ, the areas beyond national jurisdiction. And it's been extremely difficult to move much further in governing the ABNJ, the areas which are not under national control. And outer space, most of the governance of outer space is based on agreements from the 1960s and the 1970s. And these deficiencies of governance were clear and were being exacerbated by a worsening, darkening security horizon over the last few years, even before Ukraine. So I have more questions than answers, but a few possible thoughts are, first of all, I would think that there is not a one-size-fits-all. There is not a perfect fix. Rather, what we're going to think of is a multiplicity of solutions and approaches for different technologies, arenas, instruments, and techniques. And some of this will be actually insisting on the proper application of current frameworks. For example, again, taking an example from my field, but I'm sure there are others to find, Article 36 of the additional protocol to the international humanitarian law says that governments which are thinking about, which are researching, which are developing, or which are planning to deploy or are deploying weapon systems must consider their impact from the point of view of humanitarian law. Right? That is actually a legal responsibility that governments have signed up to. That is a part of international customary law now. Right? But it's very often done in the simplest of tick-boxy ways without really addressing what the issues are, which may be raised by a new military technology, such as, for example, artificial intelligence. The second thing I think is that perhaps the best will be the enemy of the good. And things change. As I said, the speed of technology is faster than the speed of policy. So I would suggest we should beware of over-design of policies and of governance initiatives. I think we also have to think across categories and not think of them as being completely segmented from each other. I think we need to be looking to include all actors and stakeholders in some way, representative way, in the process of developing governance approaches. I think we need to be informing and educating ourselves a great deal more. I suppose above all, I would say slow down and speed up. The really good thing would be to slow down development and speed up governance initiatives. So, look, with that, I'm going to say, okay, thank you very much, Dan. You've ended your keynote. I'm not going to ask for a round of applause because that would be really going too far in my double personality. Instead, I'm going to turn straight to the three members of the panel, two on screen, who I'm going to look here because we have a big screen right in front of us with your two faces on them. And first of all, very welcome here to Robin Geis and to Roshan Kanijo, and I'm sorry, but now the piece of paper with your name on it has slipped from my attention. Hang on a moment. To Kriti Sharma as well from AI for Good. And perhaps, actually, I would like to start by going out of my field, right? And therefore start with Kriti and then come back via Robin and then to Roshan, who whose field of study is closer to my own. And Kriti, we have a number of questions down which are asking, how to develop a kind of a balanced approach in relation to the governance of AI and cyber and other of these emerging technologies. You're a founder of the organization AI for Good. How do we achieve AI for good while managing to minimize the AI for bad side of the balance sheet? Take a few minutes.
Great, thank you, Dan, for your very thought-provoking keynote, I would say. And one thing that really caught my attention is your example of how you portrayed yourself as the consumer of these devices. And that's exactly a very common practice that we see across the board in public attitudes and public understanding. People do not have to be experts in technologies like the way I did. And I often like to think of it as the future way of how the world will work or is working. That kind of amazing scenario should not just be designed by geeks like myself who know how to build the technology, but not necessarily the policy. So I'm really excited to see this group coming together. To answer your question on how we design AI for good rather than bad, I really think it comes down to three key principles if we really wanted to simplify it. The first thing is it's really important to figure out who designs AI. And this is a topic that has been discussed a lot, but I really think it's a matter of bringing people from many diverse opinion bases. And I do a lot of my work in supporting applications of AI that help communities and society and also businesses, commercials of all kinds. What we see as not just good AI products or AI for good, but AI that's successful and widely adopted is when teams come from many different backgrounds to come and create it together. And to give you an example of the kind of skill set that I often try to bring into my teams are people like anthropologists and psychologists who help us design better personalities of AI or experiences that work with the people. So taking a more human-centered design approach, which is built by people from many different backgrounds. And it's easy to overlook the point around technology is so smart and it can learn, but it's also incredibly stupid. And by that, I mean, often if you look at a piece like AI, it's only as smart as the data that's fed in. So I'll give you a personal example. Facial recognition systems didn't used to work, and there's a lot of studies on that, on how these systems do not necessarily work for non-white faces, especially non-white female faces. An example, some of the studies that MIT Media Lab did, they found the error rate for facial recognition systems is about 1% for lighter-skinned men and about 25 to 30% for darker-skinned women. Now, what that might mean is these technologies often fail to recognize Michelle Obama and Oprah Winfrey. And now that's not necessarily the particularly intelligent technology, but it's overlooking a key demographic and segment. So I think good AI is inclusive. It brings people from many different backgrounds. It includes data from many different backgrounds. So that's number one. Second is, what do we do with it? Now, as somebody who's worked in many different fields of technology, I think it's quite disheartening, but I'll say it anyway, that a lot of the investment often goes into using AI to make people click more ads or the next show that you should binge watch. And I think we're at a really critical point in that we can now use this technology to solve real global challenges that face the world. And these include applications we're seeing emerge in healthcare, as was pointed out earlier, but also a lot of the work that we've been seeing in our community and network of young people coming up with solutions to the SDG-related challenges. We've done a huge amount of work in using AI to address issues of domestic violence when people can't access justice on their own. So solving the right problems with it. And then thirdly, not leaving it to the geeks like myself to figure it out. And that includes creating principles and frameworks that enable us to build technology the right way from the get-go. And it's not just regulation that comes in or wait until the regulation comes in. You know, as a technologist, I have a few degrees in computer science. I've built products my whole life, but no one ever taught me. There was no course that was done, at least when I studied, about building ethical technology or responsible technology in the right way. These conversations have now started, but I think we need just the way in professions like medicine, there's a code of conduct. We need a code of conduct, a code of ethics for the ethics of code.
So thank you so much, Emma. I find that really interesting. I mean, your first principle, it seems to me, is about inclusivity and kind of making a virtue out of diversity and thinking about it. Your second one is to focus on, you know, what it's for, as you said, the real challenges. Here's something actually which could be extremely valuable. It's created by extremely valuable human qualities, right, of creativity and innovation and imagination and so on. Let's not fritter that away. I think that's part of what you're saying. And thirdly, that connects to what, in the work we're doing at CIPRI at the moment, we're calling responsible innovation. It's a kind of, it's a take on scientific responsibility. And it applies not just in the field that you're talking about, but, you know, across the board. So I think very, very interesting, a lot of common ground there. Robin, UNIDIR has done a lot of work on the sort of the more advanced technologies, the exotic technologies, outer space, and so on. Give us a bit of a flavor of what your approach is and what, if possible, what your findings have been about the costs and the benefits here and the value of different approaches.
Dan, thanks very much. Greetings from Geneva, and first off, warm thanks I do, of course, to the Republic of Korea for their kind invitation to this important event and today's panel. So where to start in this complex field on the various technologies that UNIDIR has been working on? I would probably say that you know, managing complexity seems to be a new task required by international governance structures. I would also say that for us, artificial intelligence is one of the next big challenges around, going further than just lethal autonomous weapon systems, which to me really is the tip of the iceberg. Certainly one of the most concerning ways of how AI could be merged on a robotic platform and pose very serious risks to life and profound ethical questions and challenges, of course. But really only the tip of the iceberg, as I think increasingly, and this is for the coming decade, we will see AI being implemented across the board, often for very good reasons, for good benefits, and they need to be considered as well. Otherwise, we will not be able to design any meaningful governance structure. But at the same time, also with considerable risks, when artificial intelligence finds its way into all types of military operations and military decision-making. And that, to me, seems almost an inevitable trend, given that we're dealing with a multi-purpose technology here, which, like electricity and computers, will find its way into all of these processes. And there, probably just continuing to focus on AI for a moment, we will face strategic risks, because the technology is not very well understood. Strategic risks from inadvertent escalation. How do you react to a certain type of AI-driven behavior if it's hard to interpret it? How do we deal with an AI-driven vehicle, military vehicle that crosses the border? Is that an act of aggression? Is it something else? We don't know. So there are a lot of unknowns in the strategic domain, which are challenging. There is right now, as the world is shifting into a more confrontational world order setting, significant competitive pressures to implement AI faster than any competitors, to bring it to market, to find a first mover advantage here. That might create pressure to bring it to market, to field it in military operations before it's fully safe and secure. That's, I would say, not really an arms race, but maybe a race for speed. Then you mentioned it already, and I do think that certainly big power militaries are currently competing to achieve this level of machine speed in some of their military operations before anyone else. And then there's operational risks with AI that have to do with the brittleness of the technology. Accidents do happen. Safety issues are still probably not fully understood if you field these technologies in a competitive, very dynamic battlefield environment. That's certainly something else than a laboratory environment. And then, even if we're not talking about lethal autonomous weapon systems, there are legal, moral, ethical implications, of course, when we rely on AI-driven decision-making. But going further than just AI at the end of the day is an enabling technology. And I do think increasingly we need to look at the different technologies coming together, certainly in a battlefield context. It's not just AI, it's also better sensors, better robotics, smaller batteries, better cameras, all of this coming together and shaping, I think, the increasingly digital battlefield of the future. And this goes far beyond specific AI applications and has much broader implications, I think, for how military operations will go about in the future. And that is something that UNIDIR is increasingly considering, the convergence of the different technologies and how the various technologies apply across different domains. What does it mean if we have these technologies available for the nuclear domain, for example? Just think of early warning systems that will be increasingly relevant as everything is moving to a higher speed. Very concerning developments there. There are proliferation risks, as we have seen with drones, used to be perceived as a high-end technology just 10 years ago. Now we see it proliferating in armed conflict settings across the world. It's quite likely that the same would happen with an all-purpose technology and applications like AI. And then I could go on and on, but I'll stop it here. Of course, outer space also comes into the mix and poses new challenges. Cyberspace is there, AI-driven technology in the cyberspace for offense, for defense. All of these issues are on our radar and are part of our research work.
So thanks a lot, Robin. I'm going to give you fair warning. I'm going to come back to the point that you raised at the beginning about managing complexity and ask you a little bit more about that. I think also I just want to flag up out of what you were saying, which was is a very important kind of scan of the range of some of the issues and related to artificial intelligence, is this issue which is often known as keeping a human in the loop. What are the ethical, potentially legal, certainly the normative principles which are engaged if you are minimizing the role of the human in decisions about the use of force? It is perfectly technologically feasible, I think, to see AI being deployed, therefore for essentially autonomous, partially autonomous weapon systems that will make their own target acquisition and firing decisions in offensive as well as in defensive mode. So we're really going quite a long way and really need to ask some fundamental questions about the human in the loop. Now, Roshan, if I come to you now, and I mean, part of what you're looking at are these kind of big questions and simulations about them and so on. So what is your take on this bundle of issues that we're beginning to bring up here, and where do you put the emphasis and the priorities?
Thank you so much, Dan. Good evening, everyone. I would like to thank the Foreign Ministry of Korea for inviting me here. And as it was rightly put, that it's the canvas of emerging technology is very vast and very complicated. And artificial intelligence is developing very rapidly. And the autonomous systems and robotics, they all are having dual use. So that is the problem for us. Because on civilian sector, if you see, if there is large-scale disinformation, deepfakes, in gray zone conflict, as we have already discussed, the Internet of Things, which gives the cyber criminals a window into our personal lives. And as you rightly mentioned, the biotechnology, where gene alteration through gene editing is not only giving on one side, we are doing multicellular systems, but there are also deadly viruses which are coming up. And as far as 3D printing is concerned, it also has both societal as well as military implications. But I find that the threat is also very pronounced in the military sector, and all three military domains, whether it is air, land, or sea, is getting impacted by it. And further, what I find is the improved mobility, the interoperability of weapon systems, converging technologies. For example, if AI could be paired with quantum computing, we'll have more sophisticated weapons, and which I'm sure military will like to take in. Similarly, it is not transforming military structures, but it is also transforming operations. For example, if we see now unmanned vehicle has an ability to shadow a nuclear-armed submarine. Now, this use of AI in nuclear domain may have potentiality in future to alter the strategic stability, both in terms of crisis stability as well as arms stability. Then it is not extended only to vehicles, and it is not only extended to robots and drones, but we find a lot of vehicles and missiles. For example, classical example is a hypersonic capabilities, which most of the states are developing, and this has the capability to destabilize the threat threshold and lead to escalation. We already have direct energy weapons, whether it is anti-satellite lasers or high-powered microwaves. And in the battlefield management system also, we see we are more and more dependent onto electromagnetic spectrum. And so we are becoming more vulnerable to electronic attacks. So most of these we find is due to the fast computing, that is high power computing, which is coming up, which are being used in modeling and both in civil as well as in the arms section. The most important thing is the transformative technology which is coming up is quantum. It's talked a lot about it, and it can be used for military sensing, encryptions, and communications. So whether it is QKD or quantum cryptanalysis or quantum sensing, they're going to, in future, strategically alter the situation. And as it was rightly put up, that with the laws coming up, more and more decision-making is being given to the machines. And it is going to increase in future because, as we all know, with the machine speed increasing, time factor is more important. And the humans are a limiting factor in this. Already, a lot of weapon system has come where human being's decision is not in the field. So that is a kind of a concern which we are facing. And it's not that we have not done anything about it. We are taking baby steps about it. For example, meaningful human control of military systems, that is the MHC, which has been talked about a lot. But there we should see that we need to incorporate appropriate definitions, as well at different levels, the judgment to ensure that there is a constant cognitive awareness of the system has to be there. As far as the nuclear domain is concerned, as he was also pointing out, it's very important that human verified intelligence, especially in the early warning system and decision making, should not be based on a single source. So that becomes a problem. And also the negative impact of AI in this field should also be considered. And you cannot have fully automated systems in this field. So for my initial thing, I would like to say these are my concerns and problem areas.
Great. So what I'm going to do now is come back to each of the three of you with a question picking up out of something that you've said. I've forewarned Robin because I thought it was only fair to do so when the key word is complexity. You know, friends give each other forewarning of that kind of thing. But then I also want to suggest that after this kind of lap around these the three panelists again, be very good to get some thoughts and responses and comments from members of the audience. So be ready to be sticking your hands up in a few minutes. So Robin, when you talk about the importance of managing complexity, who is managing that complexity? How is that complexity to be managed? Is complexity to be regarded as a problem, or are we embracing complexity and starting from there? Give us some thoughts.
Excellent. Thank you, Dan. I think it should be considered a normality given the mess that we're currently in globally, and the many cascading crises that we face also beyond just the digital challenges that we're discussing today. So I think managing complexity will be a task that will stay with us, and you can add uncertainty to complexity. I don't think there's any easy or quick way out of this, and we should indeed embrace it more as a normality that we have to manage. To me, that means, like Kriti was saying, diversity is key in this regard. Different actors coming together, getting real about multi-stakeholder approaches, not just slogans on panels, but making it happen, bringing the private sector more into the governance structures in this regard. Often they drive cutting-edge innovation, they own and run much of the infrastructure. They need to be at the table, certainly when we're discussing risk awareness, but also solutions. I think there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. But this is a two-way thing. It's not just for, diplomatic fora, governmental fora, letting them in. That's one part of the equation. But the other is also convincing the private sector that they should be involved in these discussions. I don't see too many of them. Some are very active, but certainly there's a lot more who are not seen around the UN, the multilateral fora that I go to. And I think there we need better incentives, maybe advice from the behavioral sciences to what can be done to bring everyone to the table. A better business case maybe also for them. With the EU, I think for companies, it's very clear why they should be there, because there is discussions about taxation, competition law directly affects the business model. With discussions about peace and security, that's a bit more challenging. The implications are more indirect. But I think in the current world, we're very clearly seeing how peace and security affect everyone, affect the world economy, and how it should be a responsibility for everyone to be involved there. I don't want to go too long, Dan, please interrupt me, but just to also say what you said, Dan, I very much agree to this. In terms of the expectations that we have, it sometimes still seems to me that in the multilateral fora where I work, we're thinking of a treaty that could be the panacea and solve all of it. That's not going to be the case. It's, we're facing multipolar, multiplex challenges, and the solutions will need to be the same, dynamic, a lot more agile, a lot more open-minded, and there will be additions to them over time. And the sooner we get started with that, the better. And the last point maybe is in this hyper-dynamic geopolitical environment, I sometimes feel we need speed bumps. And the speed bumps really to create spaces for reflection, to step back from it all. I do think that think tanks like CIPRI or UNIDIR have a huge role to play in this regard. From the rush of the moment, taking it all back, trying to provide a bird's eye perspective on the different technology trends coming together. I think that also has to do with complexity management and a good approach to holistic governance models for the future.
Yeah, thank you very much, Robin. And I think the need for speed bumps is that it's an interesting idea, and thinking how to kind of institutionalize speed bumps would be a worthwhile challenge, because I think that is a part of thinking about responsible innovation. I also think it's worth commenting on your thought about the private sector, is that in other contexts, not thinking in more thinking about resource extraction and so on, where in previous work I've worked a lot with them, private sector actors. And the problem is that they are very good at thinking about the risks of a given activity or a given geography, for example, as those risks impact upon them. They're rather less good about thinking how their activities generate risk that impacts upon somebody else or something else, or as you said, in a quite sort of abstruse and diffuse kind of a way. And it is clear that technological development is having an enormous impact, and that does generate risks. But I think that there's perhaps not quite enough of taking responsibility for those risks. So I then wanted to turn to Kriti, because you said that it's more than part of your argument for diversity is that it shouldn't just be left to the geeks to do all of this. Right, okay. So who else should get engaged, and how does that work?
One point or counterpoint I wanted to add is on the private sector and some of the levers that really matter there. Guys, I've been hiring hundreds of data scientists and engineers on a very regular basis. And I can tell you in every single conversation, They want to understand the purpose of your business. And what are you doing? And whilst I understand, a lot of these companies haven't historically looked at risk beyond their own internal business risks, we need to build on this opportunity here that there's just such a strong movement right now in the technology community about building tech for good. And it could be coming out from certain sentiments that emerged from larger tech companies that are now considered kind of the new oil sector or the new tobacco business. Take it whichever way it comes, but really the opportunity here to mobilize the community of people who really want to build technology in the right way is a big one. And there are all these companies, private sector, in an area where skills are in such short supply or talent is in such short supply, that I find it really quite hard to believe that successful businesses in the tech world will be able to do it without understanding overall holistic risks and their impact on society. Personally, I've seen many of my friends who've left some of these companies to go do more purposeful, meaningful work. And I'm not just talking about a small number. So Robin, I would say I'll call all my friends during next forum and we'll start an after party before the party. But I also wanted to talk about who else needs to join the group. And in many ways, this counters some of the, and just bringing a more pragmatic view of slowing down technology. It's a really hard thing to do. And I don't personally agree that we should. I think we need the governance to catch up. What we do want to do, and the reason for that is it's really hard to govern and control innovation or development at that level. What we do need is stronger controls and frameworks so it's not left to self-govern for individuals who are working. To give you a very practical example, a new wave of building technology has emerged, which is very different to my world. I went to study undergrad, engineering, master's, computer science. Now I work with 15-year-olds, 12 years old, 18-year-old kids, or 8-year-old kids who've just learned to code on their own using online tools, and they have access to the same cloud computing platforms. So it's just really, really hard to create that level of control. What we can do is start more of these self-selecting principles around, or start to look at regulatory frameworks, but and helping people understand how to build good solutions to these problems. And when I say regulatory frameworks, maybe we need to do regulation by action or through examples or use cases, because just as someone who builds these things myself, there's a high-level statement that says, oh, build technology only for good. I'm like, okay, that's nice, but what's good? How do I apply it? Give me examples. Create access to databases, for example, if you're working on the bias problem, or build frameworks. And Dan, you made a very good point about black boxes. Yes, absolutely. Understanding of those systems, but there are real trade-offs. There's some algorithms that give better results, but are harder to explain. So is there a framework that helps me decide what to do when? So I think the more we can take regulatory frameworks and turn those into action, the higher chance we have of implementing some of those controls. But in my opinion, I find it really hard to see how we can slow down innovation.
Thanks a lot, Kriti. And we'll probably come back to that, but I want to ask Roshan, because I think that you picked up when you were talking about artificial intelligence and talking about laws, lethal autonomous weapon systems, or more generally autonomy in weapon systems, it comes to the question of the human in the loop. So how do you think about that operationally? I mean, in any event, and listening to Kriti as well, and listening also to Robin saying this, this technology is going to get in everywhere. In any event, the time for decision-making on key, time-critical, crisis-ridden decisions, that time is going to be incredibly short. How is it possible for humans to be in the loop? Because the loop is going to be quite small.
That is actually a problem, because more and more, if we try to delegate the decision to the machines, which is going to be there, so that is going to create a problem in the future. And that is why we need to have a kind of agreement where nations sit and decide that what are the particular weapon systems which are should be banned or should be limited in numbers, there has to be some kind of a negotiations with the multi-sectoral approach where all the stakeholders come together and they discuss on it. And here I would like to say that, as Kriti also has stated, that AI, for AI, you need to have two different approaches, one for the civil and one for the military. The military approach is going to be more opaque because nations may not like to cooperate as much as we have seen in the past. But as far as the civil thing is concerned, I think, as she rightly pointed out, that there has to be inclusiveness. And if I feel that there has to be more normative reflections, and it should emphasize on global principles and values, and through legal regulatory frameworks, we should employ a multi-sectoral approaches in a very systematic and review-based manner. And for that, the first thing what we need to do is we should have a digital ecosystem, because plurality of definitions, it hinders effective implementation. So a common definition, taxonomy, international measuring standards, all these will help in implementing of legal norms, and OECD has already started the work on that. And secondly, we can also think about clear channel of communication, creation of ecosystem where there is syntactic interoperability, though it is difficult, but through meticulous documentation of policies, accessible data sharing practices, and forums where citizen inclusiveness and multi-sector participation is there. So as far as the civilian sector is there, there are a lot of things which can be done through collaborative mechanisms. But as far as military domain is concerned, it has to be, we have to go beyond the ethical use of those weapons. We have to seriously start thinking on it, and probably the best way will be to have more information sharing and better communication, and the military as well as political, at the military as well as the political level. Because we know that these military superiority by some is going to intensify the geopolitical fissures and imbalances, and the nation which do not have this may adopt asymmetric ways, and they can also use risky untested technologies and a disruption of threshold of nuclear deterrence. So to maintain the stability and crisis prevention, you have to achieve through fixed and traceable processes. And I feel that sooner or later we have to come to monitoring of certain weapons, enforcement of robust mechanism for verification at a later stage. But to start with, there has to be information and more cooperation in these issues.
So thank you very much for that. Can I ask if then there are members of the audience with a question to put or a brief comment to make? I'm staring into the lights. At the moment, I don't see anyone. In which case, I'm going to jump straight to asking Kriti and then Robin a question or two. Kriti, I want to take up the point which you're making about there are plenty of people in the tech sector, you know, they're leaving some of the companies, there's this feeling, the need to do something, technology for good, IT for good, AI for good, and so on. Okay, accepted. There is a parallel, right, which is the nuclear age, because many of the scientists who were, perhaps not many, but several of the scientists who were engaged in the original Manhattan Project came to have very serious second thoughts, and that's where the founding of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists comes from, which remains actually an important organ for understanding these issues today. That was formed, you know, very early on. I'm not sure when, but I think it's early 50s at least that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists was founded, that it was clear that some atomic scientists, enough of a critical mass to get a hearing, to be heard in public, were objecting to the path which they had been part of setting out on. But by the mid-1980s, there were some 65 to 70,000 nuclear warheads worldwide. So there is a dynamic which pushed on despite this. And I think that that is the concern that people might have listening to what you say, is that Yes, there are individuals, even many individuals, who are turning away, but there are others who are being recruited in to take their place. Perhaps they then in their turn turn away again in a few years. There is a dynamic that moves forward. Yeah, how do you feel about that parallel and about, in a sense, about I'm channeling a skepticism just to test you out and see what your response is.
No, I love that. I love that feedback, Dan. This is exactly right. So the point, I do think the opportunity here is more about companies, and I can speak with more confidence to the private sector and larger businesses, given my background. But I do think that the companies who are investing significant amount of money in research and innovation, they have an opportunity to attract and retain this talent by building it in the right way, by putting in governance mechanisms so people understand how they're building this technology and they don't have to wait for this moment or an existential crisis. And in the design and product design world, I like to often start my exercise of building new products with this principle of let's map out the misuse cases. We spend so much time of use cases, and now I've started doing more of these exercises early on with the entire team. And yeah, you see people's internal real side come out often when they're imagining what's the worst use of this technology that could possibly happen. But I do think that if we can create these frameworks and more businesses can sign up to it, just the way we have corporate governance, we have auditing of financial records, we should be able to audit algorithms and their impact. And people, for the most part, who work in this industry, and I can't speak for everybody, but the amount of momentum I've seen in explainable AI research, in ethical AI, there are like 200 plus organizations that are working on it. There's a real desire to want to do that. We need to create the controls and the mechanisms so people don't have to, this talent is hard to attract, really, really hard, and even harder to retain. And so we don't lose that whole group of people. And then the other part, which goes back to my initial 3 observations, is the kind of people who could come into this sector because there's bigger opportunity to do things the right way. And we don't fall into the traps of some of the other accidents in the past is quite a substantial population as well. So if you look at talent pools, which is, if you talk to any CTO, any product person, any design leader, right now, their number one question or challenge is how to attract talent and retain them. And I think there's an opportunity to engage this community in a very meaningful way by helping create those governance mechanisms and the capabilities that make it practical and easier for the geeks like me to build good technology.
Thanks very much. That's very helpful. Robin, I'm going to turn to you now with a question for a quickish answer, because we've got 3 questions come in from the online audience, which I'm going to put to all 3 of you. And what I wanted to ask you really is, well, what did you mean by speed bumps?
By speed bumps, I think actually at the end of the day, I think I mean the UN, which and I didn't mean the speed of innovation. Just to be clear, I don't think we can slow down innovation, and if we try to do that, no government's model would fly. So it's slowing down the many processes that are now emerging around these new technologies, and inflation of processes in the cyber domain, in the AI domain. We have, I think, over 600 initiatives, also in the private sector, developing principles, standards for the design and the use of AI. That's all great, but I think if we go back to what a previous speaker said about the plurality of definitions and concepts, the UN has a specific and unique role to start bringing these things together on a global level. And necessarily that will slow things down, and sometimes, down to snail's pace. And of course, we would wish it could all go faster, but there is a geopolitical reason why it can't go faster, because there are tensions, there are different understandings on many of these issues. Still, at the end of the day, I think the structure, the hub function, the network function that the UN could offer in this regard is key to a global governance model. And to really bring the benefits and the risks together, the UN is the prime forum to also try to align technological development with the SDGs at the end of the day. And I think that needs to be an important factor also in this entire endeavor.
Thanks very much. So let's take the questions which have come in from the online audience, and I'm kind of going to cast them out, and one of you will jump in. There's three. I'm going to ask them in an order which I hope is an order that ascends through the range of optimism, at least as far as the answers are concerned. Let's see if my theory works. So the first question taken like that is that in addition to artificial intelligence, which are the technologies that might develop beyond human control, posing threats to humanity and to security and well-being? Which are the ones that we should be focusing on? We've listed a number out of concerns between us, but Roshan, would you add to that?
I think it's more to do with converging technologies which are going to be more important, because if you see AI and if it gets combined with quantum, then it is going to create weapons which are going to be very this thing that would create problem for us. For example, already if you see there are quantum gravimeters which can detect the moving submarines. That's what they say in future. And also quantum radars which can detect low-flying aircrafts. So they are going to impact the strategic stability. So it is the converging of technologies which I feel in future, not one particular, but that is going to create a problem.
Right. So in a sense, dislocating the question. It's not another kind of technology, it's the convergence between them. Robin, Kriti, would you go along with that? Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, I could think of quantum human enhancement technologies, but at the end of the day, I fully agree. It's the fusion of the biological, physical, and virtual worlds that we're seeing, and that will create new risks that possibly some of which we cannot fully control or don't fully understand.
Right. So then to the second question, which begins with a sort of a statement that the concept of security is getting more expansive. And I guess that is a reference to getting beyond thinking of just what is often called hard security or state security, or thinking of security in military terms, but also thinking of security in what is often called human security terms, but can also be just about thinking about a broader range of issues apart from political rivalries, ambitions, and greed that generate conflict, like the pressure of climate change and environmental deterioration that we were discussing earlier. So in this context, and I guess in the context of the current state of international relations, how plausible are we being? How realistic are we being? Is it plausible to come up with governance or norms on the responsible use of emerging technologies which can cover these various different concepts of security, military, including human? Robin and then Roshan, I guess this would be very much meat and drink for you, and then see what Kriti thinks about it from a different perspective. But Robin first.
Two quick answers. I think, even if maybe in the heat of the current moment, we cannot be too optimistic about any quick solutions. We need to continue working on them. Things change very quickly. There's certainly is still some common ground on some of these mega trends, and so we cannot afford to not work on these issues. That's one, but the other is more doctrinal perhaps on the security notion. I would say, I think for the past 20 years, this trend towards ever more securitization has been rather a negative trend, because it led to the shrinking of humanitarian spaces, it led to the shrinking of human rights protections. The war against terrorism was one example of this maybe over-securitization, at least this is how it was perceived by many. But I do think now that we're in this interconnected world facing so many cascading crises at the same moment, we could also expand security in a more positive way, bring development issues in as an integral part of a better and more holistic understanding of security. So it's a very interesting question to which I have no concrete answer, but just to say that this, I think, is something that we will need to reflect on quite a bit in this confrontational setting that we're now in, and where everything, global economy, global health, energy questions, all have direct and severe security implications, and implications for the well-being of humanity and the planet at the end of the day.
Roshan.
I agree with what he's saying, but I feel that there is a potential threat because you see already deepfakes and large-scale disinformation, all these things keep happening. And there is no one solution to that. So I think more interaction with the public before making any laws is another area where we can look for public participation. And basically, if we see AI, for example, so what are the three main arms in it? It is the government, it is the private sector, and it is the citizen. So the more collaboration and communication and you have with them, the better understanding it comes. And probably that is one area where we need to work and see how it goes.
So Kriti, I think that's a nice segue. It's over to you. And although you don't know it yet, this also segues neatly into the next question. But what's your response to the thoughts you were just hearing?
I wonder if there's something similar to the 2.0 version of data privacy movement or cybersecurity policy, primarily data privacy and data security movement that we saw that has had some success in that. From where I'm sitting, I see pretty much every large company board having data and cybersecurity in one of their top 2 to 3 agenda items. And a lot of that has come from wide space regulatory movements that have in certain countries been able to keep up with the innovation. And in some markets and models, we've seen even sandboxes emerge. I personally think that's quite a cool idea when it works, and we've seen success of that in the fintech world, right, where you can actually work with the regulator, because people building the technology often are as much in a gray zone of fog as the regulator. So perhaps this is more of a, I think someone used the word or the term broadly around progressive. I think it was yourself, Dan, on how we can build regulation or governance that evolves, and perhaps building an international sandbox for some of these challenges could be a place to start. And that might bring more of my friends to you, Robin.
I just want to, before I come back to the question I'm going to put you, the third from the online audience, I just want to see if there's anybody in the audience here in the hall who now getting their last chance to ask a question, because time is ticking on and we're going to close the session fairly soon. If there's anybody who has thought that they would, after all, like to ask a question, you get one last chance. It's a kind of like an auctioneer. It's going, and gone. Okay, so Kriti, here was the third question, which is asking you to focus, to be a little bit kind of concrete, if it's possible, or specific at least, about effective measures that encourage, the question says the industry, but I'm going to loosen that, actors in the industry, to participate in the process of establishing some, and again I'm loosening the question, some aspects of global governance on the use of new technologies that have emerged and are emerging. How would one encourage that?
I think you briefly touched on it in the previous question. I just genuinely believe, so there's some problems, and let's break it down a little bit in the interest of being specific. There are some problems where the answers are a lot easier to define. It's more about enabling actions. Examples of those, and yeah, we've talked about a lot of advanced emerging technologies, but there's a very basic technology that is that has a lot of potential for misuse, and that is just pure data, access to data, and even just very basic analytics on it, not even AI. So some of those capabilities, we already have a lot more tangible measures and ways of applying capabilities. So that's more about enforcing it, and the way you encourage that behavior is embedded right into the heart of governance that already exists, rather than, it doesn't require a lot of new stuff. When we are looking at exponential technologies where the state is evolving and improving, I'm just a very strong believer in a collaborative approach, and that might be more of an invitation to come and design that in a more open sandbox environment where we explore these problems together. Because if you think about a lot of companies, they vary in resources and how much they can invest in each of these different problems, and a policy team may not always be the first thing they can invest in, and it would again be very one-dimensional. So a lot of value in these problems comes from if you can learn from other industries. For example, fintech is very keen to learn from bio and health tech, and legal tech is very interested in learning from what happened in the banks and during the fintech revolution, what solutions they found. So this interdisciplinary place where there's more in terms of value that the businesses can get back would justify the investment and the time.
Okay, thanks. So it turns out there is one, and I couldn't say it properly, but there it is. Yes, please ask your question, madam.
Thank you for the talk today. I agree the definition is critical for this topic. Emerging technologies are typically defined within the digital, like AI or machine learning, distributed ledger, quantum technologies. I have a question. What are the panel's considerations for the other sectors, like biology or biotechnologies and materials and manufacturing technologies?
So I'll ask Roshan and Robin to take a very quick stab at that, and then I'm going to ask each of you for your kind of one final takeaway, or the thought that you want the audience to take away with them. So Roshan first, and then Robin answering this question, and then we'll go around you again with the final question.
I believe, yes, we need to have consideration for other technologies also, that what we call like NBIC, and like nanotechnology, biotechnology, information and cognitive sciences. So here also we need to have regulatory measures. What we talk about AI, most of them will also apply here also, because regulatory mechanism is risk mitigation. All these things will apply there also. And in this field, I think nanotechnology, they have already done a lot. There is a legal framework also for them. So slowly, if all these technologies has to come up, and measures have to be taken. It cannot be one fit all. It has to be different approaches for different domains, which needs to be discussed.
Thanks a lot, Roshan. Robin, your thoughts on the same thing?
Yeah, I can keep it very short. I fully agree with what Roshan said there. I do think that in the biotechnology field and in the space security field, very similar structurally, very similar issues arise. It will have to be a multi-stakeholder approach of sorts. There is significant commercial interest and innovation involved in these fields. It will have to do with the convergence of different technology. Just take AI coming to the field of bio and enhancing biosequencing, bioengineering, and so on. So I think we're facing very similar structural questions in these domains as well.
Okay, so now what I would like to do is to offer each of you somewhere around, 30 seconds, 1 minute, absolute maximum, for a kind of a quite crisp thought that it is that you would like the audience to take away with them. I would like to go Roshan, Robin, Kriti in that order. So Roshan first, your challenge?
I would like to say that, yes, there are a lot of emerging technologies and the challenges are huge, but the global governance system has already started working on it. It is a little slow, but we have started at least debating on a lot of issues. So that's a positive for me, and I'm optimistic. I feel that slowly and steadily, as more and more countries start thinking about it, there'll be more collaborations, and I'm sure good will happen with that. And especially with what you call it, interactions like this, it will definitely, ideas will come up, and which will soon take shape for regulations and all. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think interactions like this have a very important place. Robin?
I think a large part of the complexity management that I said was going to be key is an open-mindedness to try new things out. It's certainly not easy in the current geopolitical confrontational setting, but it's absolutely needed, I think, in this very complex, fast-moving digital sphere, and the digital transformation has only just begun. So I do think we need to open up to new formats, different types of stakeholders. From my perspective, I think here at UNIDIR, we're trying to create some safe spaces where trust can be built between new communities so that they can warm up to one another and also see the benefits of having these mutual dialogues. And then initially you asked me about one finding from UNIDIR. One thing that I can say, because we are holding and convening many of these dialogues, is that even if it takes a while to get everyone warmed up to the idea of talking to new audiences and stakeholders. Usually the added value and the takeaways are very good. And that's something where we need to continue to be open-minded, I think.
That's great, Robin. Thank you. And Kriti, over to you.
Dan, I'd close with one of the points you raised, that there's not going to be one regulation at one point or one governance model that's going to work. And our conversation and debate today really brought it to life, that this is going to be a conversation that we all build on together. And I would just say, if we can create that openness to exploring a healthy balance between the pace of development and the pace of sustainable development to be able to bring this technology to life, that would be just really powerful and very encouraging.
So thank you all three. I'm going to add in my final thoughts on this for the moment as well. And I'm quite struck by accounts which I have read based on long interviews with people who were working in the financial sector, primarily in London, the ones which I read, at the time of the financial crash in 2008, where they talked about the fact that their managers, their bosses, did not know what they were doing. So these very complex financial instruments, which they were packaging and layering debt from all different kinds of places and selling it on with different securities and so on, and debt leveraging ratios which were just going crazy, they weren't being monitored properly. And what I take out of that for this conversation is not that monitoring of the individuals is important, but that unpacking these problems all the time, keeping on unpacking them, re-unpacking them again, taking another look. It's really, really important. We only are empowered in relation to these issues if we understand them and understand how things are working. We've been told, and I agree, and that's why I'm saying it now, that we need to embrace complexity and diversity. We've got to acknowledge uncertainty. We've got to acknowledge that we may not get everything right, and that's one of the reasons why we need a very variegated approach to governance. And we need to be collaborating. We need to be working together. I would like once again to thank the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for making this session possible. I would like to thank Roshan, Robin and Kriti for their wonderful contributions to the discussion. And thank you for your attention, and close the session with that. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you very much. Let's give a big round of applause. Thank you so much. And please return to your seats. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of the last session of the 2022 WESF, the session 3, Emerging Technologies and Security. We have shared insights and thoughts under the theme of Future of Global Governance on Emerging Technologies. I hope you had meaningful time with us. And once again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us yesterday for opening ceremony and the session 1, and today's session 2 and the session 3. And of course, thank you for joining us at the CIPRI special session as well at the beginning of the forum today. And ladies and gentlemen, before you leave, please submit post-forum survey that you can find via the QR code on the forum leaflet. And ladies and gentlemen, we had the 2022 WESF under the theme of Past, Present, and Future of Emerging Security Threats, Way Forward for Trust-Based International Cooperation. We hope that this year's forum was a meaningful occasion to all of our participants, online and offline, in raising common awareness and examine possibilities to prevent potential future threats as well. With that, ladies and gentlemen, now we'd like to have meaningful closing remarks. So now please allow me to invite Mr. Ham Sang-uk, a Deputy Minister for Multilateral and Global Affairs of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Let's welcome him with a big round of applause.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, the 2022 World Emerging Security Forum has come to a close. I would like to thank our speakers for their insightful presentations and constructive comments. During the last 2 days, we gathered under the banner of promoting international cooperation based on trust to better understand today's emerging security threats and find ways to tackle them. The discussion served as an invaluable opportunity to share lessons learned from past experiences, to face up to our current reality of security threats, and to foresee threats to come. Many ideas and insights have been put forward by diverse stakeholders, and they are highlighted in one voice that we should be fast, agile, and responsive. When the World Emerging Security Forum was launched last year, nobody expected the outbreak of war in Ukraine. While unexpected threats to international peace will continue to emerge with greater complexity, we can address them better with stronger cooperation, solidarity, and preparedness. This was also the underlying message throughout the last 2 days. The forum also provided the opportunity to highlight the importance of creating mechanisms to facilitate cooperation among diverse stakeholders. Given the nature of the emerging threat, a state-centric approach can no longer be a solution. Working closely with non-state actors, especially the private sector, is the only way forward. Ladies and gentlemen, as Korea envisions becoming a global pivotal state, we are committed to making greater contributions to the peaceful solution of our common challenges. And launching the World Emerging Security Forum as an open platform for all stakeholders to respond to emerging security threats is part of such commitments. I hope all of us can work together in the coming years to develop this forum into a truly multi-stakeholder platform where we can share innovative ideas and promote partnerships to address our greatest threat to humanity. Let me close by thanking you once again for joining us. I hope to see you again next year in Seoul. I thank you very much.
Deputy Minister Ham, thank you very much for your meaningful closing remarks. This brings us to the end of the 2022 World Emerging Security Forum. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again for staying with us until the very end, despite your busy schedules. This has been Jessica Lee. Thank you and goodbye. Thank you.